There are stories that were never meant to be spoken aloud, names scratched out of ledgers, pages burned before the ink was dry. But sometimes when the wind moves through the moss the right way, the truth murmurs back. Beneath the crooked oaks of Wilcox County, Alabama, lies what used to be Belhaven Plantation, 3,000 acres of soil black enough to stain your hands forever. In the spring of 1841, production records there show something impossible. Yields soaring 47% in a single season. Historians blamed luck, rainfall, superstition. What they refused to confront was the human experiment that made it happen. Hidden in the Granger family's archives are letters and account books bound in cracked green leather. They describe a widow named Constance Granger, 28 years old, suddenly in command of 63 enslaved souls and a mountain of debt. But more chilling than the debts is the method she created to erase them. It was not a new machine, nor a whip, nor a sermon. It was a system. A design that reached into the human mind, rewiring loyalty itself. The documents say she called it the reward. The word looks harmless on paper, yet every man who heard it would come to fear it more than punishment. Because the reward was not pain, it was permission. Permission to enter the main house, to be spoken to as if one's name still meant something. A private audience with the mistress where, for a few hours, a man could feel almost human again. And then the illusion would vanish, leaving him hungrier, faster, and more obedient than before. Within weeks, the plantation's output defied every agricultural expectation of the age. But behind those miraculous numbers was a contagion of silence. Neighbors whispered that Belhaven worked its people to death without ever raising a whip. The overseer stopped sleeping, and Constance Granger began writing in a cipher so dense that even her descendants could never fully translate it. Tonight, we open what remains of that cipher. We trace how one woman discovered that control is not enforced by chains. It's chosen once someone convinces you the cage is your idea. At first, no one believed the system would hold. The enslaved men whispered that the widow was testing them, that the so-called reward would end in punishment once she proved who was disloyal. But the first man returned from her house unscathed. The next week, another followed, and soon the pattern became fact. Every Saturday, the week's most productive worker was summoned to the veranda of the big house. He would step inside, stripped of chains and tools, and sit across from Constance Granger at a candle-lit table. There was no feast, no promise of freedom, just questions about the fields, the weather, the other workers. She asked what made them tired, what they feared, what they hoped for when they closed their eyes, and then she listened. That was the true power of her design, listening as a weapon. When the men returned to the quarters, they spoke less. Something about being heard, about tasting respect, even false respect, made silence feel safer than speech. Within a month, the songs that had once risen from the fields each evening fell quiet. The rhythm of collective endurance gave way to the drumbeat of competition. Each man now carried his own invisible scoreboard in his mind. Each believed that next week's reward would prove he mattered more than the rest. Constance understood something that overseers and masters rarely grasped, that a person who competes for recognition polices himself more ruthlessly than any whip could manage. The overseer's role shrank to bookkeeping. His tallies of daily output became the plantation's new scripture. Men drove their bodies to collapse chasing numbers written in chalk. When one fainted in the heat, another took his place before the body cooled, afraid that resting even a moment might cost him the chance to be chosen. From the veranda, Constance watched it unfold like an experiment running perfectly. In her diary, she wrote, "They destroy each other with hope." And that line, 5 words, explains the secret foundation of every control system that would follow. From plantations to factories to the fluorescent offices of the modern age, teach a man to believe that suffering earns him worth, and he will work himself into the grave while calling it destiny. By early summer, the air over Belhaven felt charged, like thunder waiting behind a blue sky. The fields moved with a feverish rhythm. Pickers no longer worked in lines but in separate, desperate bursts, each man trying to outgather the others. The overseer, Silas Drummond, began to notice that his old authority no longer mattered. He shouted less, kept his whip coiled at his side, and spent his evenings copying numbers into the ledgers Constance Granger demanded each night. At first he thought the widow's methods foolish, too soft, too strange. But the figures on the parchment didn't lie. In 45 days, Belhaven had already produced what used to take a season. When Drummond handed over the reports, Constance would study them with that cold, bright focus that unsettled him. "You see, Silas," she said once, "discipline is cheaper when it feels like desire." He didn't ask her to explain. What unnerved him most was the change in her house. Lamps burned later than ever, the scent of ink and tallow thick in the halls. Constance no longer dined with the neighboring planters who came to court her. She spent those hours writing in a small leather journal, recording not harvests, but habits. Drummond glimpsed one page. Lists of names, paired with single words: obedient, restless, proud, broken. It looked less like management and more like cataloguing souls. Rumor spread through the quarters that she could tell who would live or die just by reading the day's tally. Men began working past exhaustion, terrified that slipping behind would erase them from her pages. When two fell sick with fever, others carried them into the fields at dawn so they wouldn't lose credit for the day. The overseer tried to stop it, but Constance ordered him to let the experiment run. "They must believe the reward chooses them," she said, "not me." One evening, he found her standing on the veranda, watching torches flicker among the cabins. "Do you see it?" she asked quietly. "They think they're chasing hope, but hope is chasing them." Drummond realized then that she no longer cared about cotton or debt. She was testing something older and darker, the point at which obedience becomes faith. By midsummer, Belhaven no longer resembled a working plantation so much as a closed experiment. The rows of cotton were immaculate, the ledgers immaculate, the people inside them hollow. Each morning began with a bell, but no one needed to be called. Men were already waiting in the half-light, eyes fixed on the scales and the chalkboard where their yields would appear. They had learned to measure their own worth in pounds and ounces. Constance rarely left the big house now. She communicated through notes, short, precise, signed with her initials. The overseer received them folded and sealed with wax. Increase output by 3%, rotate the pickers, silence the songs. It was as if the human voice itself had become an inefficiency she meant to erase. When Drummond brought her the day's figures, she hardly looked up. "Do you know what you're witnessing?" she asked him once. "The mathematics of belief." The phrase haunted him. Belief, he thought, required mercy. Numbers did not. Yet the people in the fields moved as if driven by something sacred. They whispered the widow's name like a prayer or a warning, unsure which it was. Small tokens began appearing near the steps of the main house: folded bits of cloth, carved wood, a flower pressed flat as paper. No one claimed them, and no one removed them. It was easier to let the myth grow. When one of the older men collapsed and died under the sun, Constance ordered no burial until the next day's quotas were met. The act terrified the quarters into silence, but it also deepened the strange devotion she had cultivated. The dead man's tools were laid neatly by the path, and others stepped forward to use them. Productivity soared again. Drummond began keeping his own secret notes, writing that Belhaven was becoming a machine that eats itself. Yet he couldn't look away. The system worked too perfectly. Cotton spilled from the gins faster than the wagons could haul it. Constance's debt vanished, replaced by profit she barely acknowledged. What fascinated her now was the transformation of minds, the proof that authority once internalized required no overseer at all. She had built a structure of invisible walls, and everyone, even Drummond, was inside it. By the time autumn bled into the fields, the perfection of Belhaven had become unbearable. The cotton glowed too white, the silence too absolute. Drummond no longer shouted. He walked among the rows with a notebook and a tremor in his hand. He noticed how the workers' faces were changing, tired, vacant, yet lit with something close to worship. They no longer looked at him. They looked toward the house. Inside, Constance had turned her office into a kind of shrine to her own experiment. Pages of numbers lined the walls like scripture. A map of the plantation was pinned over her desk, covered in symbols, triangles, circles, and tally marks. Every figure, she told Drummond, is a heartbeat. Together, they form a pulse that obeys me. He wanted to tell her that hearts weren't equations, but the proof was everywhere he looked. Then, one morning, the pattern broke. A field hand named Samuel stopped working and stood motionless until the others halted too. He dropped his sack, looked toward the big house, and said loudly enough for all to hear, "What happens if the reward stops?" The question hung in the heat like thunder. No one answered. By evening, the chalkboard was wiped clean, and Constance refused to name a new winner. The entire plantation held its breath. The next day, productivity collapsed. Men drifted between rows, waiting for a signal that never came. Without the illusion of choice, they seemed unsure how to move at all. Constance watched from her veranda, expressionless, while Drummond paced the yard, begging her to reinstate the system. "You've proven your point," he said. "Now let them work." She only whispered, "I want to see if faith survives its God." For 3 days the field stood still, then murmurs began, low, rhythmic, rising from the quarters at dusk. It wasn't the old songs of endurance, but something new, her name, spoken and answered in call and response, reshaped into a prayer. Drummond felt the hairs lift on his neck. They weren't waiting for her command anymore. They were creating one of their own. When he told Constance what he'd heard, she smiled faintly. Then the experiment has begun to think. By late autumn, the nights had grown longer, and with them, the murmurs. What had begun as scattered voices became a single, low vibration rolling out from the quarters each evening. It wasn't rebellion yet. It was remembering. Drummond would stand at the edge of the fields listening to it, the sound of men and women reclaiming something language couldn't name. He understood it meant the numbers were losing their grip. Constance noticed too. The ledgers no longer calmed her. Rows of perfect figures could not drown out the pulse rising through the soil. She walked the veranda at night, candle in hand, watching the faint glow of torches from the cabins. "They're communicating in silence," she said. "I can feel it." The overseer tried to tell her that people need songs, that work breaks without rhythm, but she shook her head. "This isn't rhythm, it's memory." The next morning she gathered everyone in the yard. Her voice carried sharp and clear. "The reward is finished. You will be measured by work alone." No one replied. They simply stood, eyes steady, breathing in unison. For the first time, Constance felt the strange reversal of power, the way attention itself could turn against its owner. In her journal she wrote, "They see me as part of the system, not its source." Drummond saw the shift more plainly. The workers began organizing the day on their own, starting earlier, ending together, refusing to compete. The yield dropped, but the discipline became collective again, born of mutual protection. When one collapsed, 2 others lifted him before Constance's watchers could notice. She called it defiance. Drummond saw it as something older, a return to the unwritten order that had always outlasted masters. One evening, a storm rolled over the river. Lightning flashed behind the main house, turning its columns into bones of light. Constance stood in the doorway, drenched, stay, ring at the fields where no one moved. The silence was complete, almost holy. She whispered, "They've inverted the machine." That night the overseer packed his things. He left his final note in her ledger. "You taught them control, now they own it." When dawn came, the widow of Belhaven faced an army of quiet eyes, and for the first time she had no numbers to command them. When the harvest ended, the land itself seemed to exhale. The stalks turned brittle and grey, the last bolls picked clean. Belhaven stood in an uncanny stillness that felt almost deliberate, as though the plantation had become aware of its own silence. Constance's numbers, once immaculate rows of certainty, stopped aligning. Her records no longer made sense, figures blurred where they used to define. Something invisible had shifted. Drummond's disappearance spread through Wilcox County as rumor. Some said he'd gone north, others that he drowned crossing the Alabama River. Constance did not correct them. She rarely left the house now, moving through its halls like a ghost keeping inventory of her own mistakes. Her notebooks remained open, filled with half-sentences. Belief decays when shared too widely, and control is pure only in isolation. Even her handwriting trembled, as if her own certainty was fracturing, but the people in the quarters began to speak again, carefully, quietly, building something communal out of the ruins of competition. They shared stories about ancestors, real and imagined, who had outlived their masters. They rebuilt their songs. What Constance had mistaken for obedience had become a language of resistance. Each voice carried memory. Each rhythm carried warning. By the time county officials arrived to audit Belhaven's miraculous year, they found a plantation that functioned without visible direction. The fields were tended, the stores accounted for, yet the mistress offered no explanations. She simply handed over her ledgers and said, "It runs itself now." They took that as pride. In truth, it was confession. Word of Belhaven's transformation began spreading downriver, carried by traders and itinerant preachers. They spoke of a place where work continued after authority disappeared, a plantation haunted not by death but by self-ordering mate. Dolls, some called it madness, others a miracle. The story traveled because it resonated, the idea that control, once planted deep enough, can grow without a master. It whispered a truth larger than Alabama, larger than its time, and that's the part that survives, the parable hidden in the dirt. Systems built on domination always imagine they can perfect obedience, but every design carries the seed of its opposite. Teach people to measure themselves by power, and eventually they'll measure power itself and find it wanting. Decades later, travelers passing through Wilcox County still spoke of the machine that learned to think. The plantation house was mostly empty by then, its windows boarded and its ledger books scattered across the floor. Yet those who walked past swore they could hear faint rhythms from the fields, ghostly echoes of men and women working in perfect synchrony, guided by nothing but habit. Historians tried to reduce it to an agricultural curiosity, but every generation retold the story in a new form. When the sharecropping system replaced slavery, the idea returned. The worker who toiled harder, believing effort alone could buy freedom. When factories rose after the war, overseers became supervisors, the chalkboard became the time clock, and competition for the reward took the shape of wages and titles. The plantation's logic had only changed uniforms. The invisible architecture of Belhaven spread like a pattern in glass, too faint to see, too strong to break. Governments studied motivation. Companies studied productivity. They learned the same lesson Constance Granger had written in her failing hand. People will obey longest when they think they are choosing. It was a psychology that outlived the century. Numbers replaced chains, incentives replaced threats, and control became a language so familiar that no one questioned who wrote it. By the early 20th century, Belhaven's records vanished into archives, catalogued under experimental management, but fragments survived. Letters, a single ledger page, and that one chilling sentence in her journal. They destroy each other with hope. Scholars quoted it without context, not realizing how far it would travel. Every time a person believed that more work, more loyalty, or more sacrifice would grant them meaning, they were echoing her experiment. If you've ever looked at a screen tracking your worth in numbers, sales, clicks, steps, hours, and felt both pride and exhaustion, you've met the ghost of Belhaven. The plantation was never just a place. It was a prototype. It showed how control survives revolution, war, and reform by changing its name. And here's the question the legend still asks. When the overseer disappears but the work continues, who's truly in command? That's the inheritance buried in the Alabama soil, the realization that systems don't die. They adapt. The lesson of Belhaven is not confined to the cotton fields of 1841. It echoes in the hum of fluorescent offices, the clatter of factories, the endless scroll of screens that measure performance in likes, clicks, and hours. Every system that claims to reward effort carries the same ghost, the illusion that participation equals freedom, that compliance equals choice. Constance Granger discovered the principle in its rawest form, a masterclass in psychological architecture, and the world has been refining it ever since. Modern institutions rely on it. Incentives are no longer rations or Saturday rewards. They are titles, bonuses, algorithmic rankings. The people inside the system rarely notice the invisible wires guiding their actions. Productivity, obedience, and ambition are engineered to align with outcomes designed by someone else. And, like the men at Belhaven, many will compete against one another, believing that surpassing their peers grants dignity, identity, or even survival. In truth, it grants only more control to the architect of the system. The eerie consistency is what makes the story unforgettable. Belhaven was not the first place this happened, nor the last, but it was a crucible, a moment when someone understood that control doesn't need brutality, only perception. Fear is unnecessary when desire can be manipulated. Hope becomes a leash longer than any chain. Drummond saw it firsthand. The men in the field saw it too, though they never named it. And we, standing centuries later, still walk its blueprint without realizing it. There's a symbolic phrase that encapsulates the essence of Belhaven. The machine learns through longing. Pause for a moment and commit it to memory. Comment it below. Let it anchor you. Let it serve as a key. In engaging with it, you acknowledge that the systems around you shape thought, desire, and action. That acknowledgement is the first step toward understanding, not submission, but awareness. Awareness is the beginning of mastery. The invisible architecture persists everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, in social hierarchies, in the very way modern life measures achievement. It lures participation by offering recognition, dignity, even intimacy, but always at a cost hidden from view. Just as the men at Belhaven labored for the promise of the reward, so do we work today, often unaware that the system was designed to consume us. And the most frightening part: systems adapt. They learn from resistance, reshape around it, and turn rebellion into another measure of efficiency. Belhaven did not end with the widow's experiment. It continues, evolving with every human mind that believes it is choosing. To understand Belhaven is to understand control itself. Constance Granger's genius, or her terror, was not in brute force but in crafting an invisible architecture that shaped thought. She discovered a principle that modern institutions rely on without realizing its origin. People will regulate themselves more efficiently than any overseer can, if they believe they are earning recognition. At Belhaven, numbers replaced authority. Cotton yields became both the currency and the measure of obedience. Men pushed past exhaustion, broke the rhythm of mutual aid, and internalized a hierarchy that existed only because they accepted it. Each tally, each reward, rewired desire. It was the quietest form of domination, obedience disguised as agency, competition disguised as hope. Drummond, the overseer, watched as his role diminished. He was no longer the enforcer. He was merely the record-keeper for a system that required no supervision beyond its own internal logic. Fast forward to today, and the parallels are striking. Corporations use KPIs and performance metrics. Governments use ratings and compliance systems. Social media algorithms track every action to subtly incentivize behavior. People compete against each other for praise, promotion, or visibility, often unaware that the reward is curated to maintain the structure of control. The illusion of choice is a leash far longer than any chain. The machine learns through longing, just as Constance wrote in her journal centuries ago. Every decision becomes a transaction. Every act of perceived autonomy feeds the system. And the most brilliant and terrifying part of Belhaven's design is that it left no scars visible to outsiders. To a casual observer, the plantation was productive. To anyone who witnessed the transformation up close, it was a psychological crucible. Minds bent without breaking, obedience earned without threat. At hope weaponized against its own possessors, Constance understood human nature in its rawest, darkest form. Desire is more obedient than fear. Hope is more powerful than punishment, and recognition, even false recognition, can turn a population into its own enforcer. That principle, observed and refined, resonates in the systems around us every day. It is invisible, almost imperceptible, yet pervasive, reaching into behaviors, ambitions, and decisions, shaping the unseen architecture of modern life. The moral calculus of Belhaven is what haunts us most. Constance Granger's experiment was efficient, brilliant, and terrifying because it stripped away the need for overt cruelty and replaced it with subtle domination. She didn't need to threaten. She didn't need to punish. Hope, desire, and the illusion of agency were enough to bend the human will. The men in the fields became instruments of their own subjugation, believing that achievement would grant them dignity, when in truth it merely reinforced the architecture of control. Drummond sensed the horror early. He understood that obedience derived from incentive is not loyalty. It is compulsion disguised as aspiration. Each man who entered the house for the reward returned changed, less a person than a function of the system. And yet, they were willing participants, because the system promised something they craved: recognition, attention, a trace of autonomy in a world that offered none. Constance had discovered what centuries of rulers, priests, and managers would eventually refine. The mind is far more malleable than the body. This lesson is neither distant nor abstract. In today's corporations, governments, and social networks, the same principle persists. Metrics, ratings, and digital validation are the modern reward. People compete, self-monitor, and even police one another for the promise of recognition, rarely questioning who benefits most. Just as at Belhaven, the system thrives on this subtle internalization of control. The overseers vanish. The population regulates itself, unaware that their labor, attention, and hope feed a hidden architecture. There is a cost. Not just physical exhaustion or lost time, but fractured solidarity, eroded trust, and the quiet erosion of agency. At Belhaven, neighbors once bound by shared survival turned on one another for the illusion of favor. In modern systems, collaboration becomes competition, and ambition is weaponized against the individual. Constance's experiment revealed the psychological levers that make such systems sustainable: exploit desire, mask authority, measure performance, and let people police themselves. It is a cautionary pattern encoded into history, yet invisible to the untrained eye. The more we chase rewards designed by others, the deeper we fall into the architecture of control. And the chilling truth is that the machine is always learning, refining its own mechanisms through each act of compliance, each silent surrender to the illusion of choice. The true horror of Belhaven, and of every system that follows its design, was not in the numbers, nor in the yield, nor even in the fleeting hope of the reward. It was in what it did to the individual mind. Each man who labored under Constance Granger's system was forced to calculate his worth in pounds of cotton, in hours worked, in compliance earned. Identity became a ledger. Desire became a measurement. Every choice was filtered through the lens of the system. The psychological consequences were profound. Isaac, Caleb, Samuel, names etched into the whispers of the quarters, experienced a new kind of torment. It was not fear of punishment, but the crushing weight of expectation. To succeed meant survival. To fail, erasure from the narrow circle of favor. Their agency, long suppressed by chains and circumstance, was now weaponized against them by something far subtler. They became enforcers of their own compliance, policing themselves with a precision no overseer could impose. Drummond understood this, and it frightened him more than any whip ever could. The men's loyalty was no longer to him or to Constance, but to the system itself and the invisible calculations it demanded. Even those who resisted internally were forced to participate externally, and in that tension, the gap between thought and action, power had its strongest hold. Constance had discovered the most efficient method of control imaginable: make people want the cage. This is the pattern that echoes through time. Modern workplaces, social networks, educational institutions, every environment where reward is calibrated, measured, and selectively granted mirrors this architecture. Humans are programmed to compete for recognition, often forgetting the one who designed the game. Self-surveillance becomes normalized, solidarity erodes, The individual is left exhausted, perpetually striving and paradoxically, or obedient than any coercion could have achieved. The insidious beauty of Belle Haven lies in its subtlety. There were no chains beyond the cotton sack, no punishments beyond exhaustion, yet obedience was total. The men were both participants and victims, captives of a system that disguised itself as opportunity. And that is the lesson the modern world has inherited. The mind can be enslaved more completely when it believes it is free. By late summer, the subtle fractures Constance Granger had engineered began to reveal themselves in the quarters. The men who once relied on one another for survival now measured themselves against one another. Every glance and movement weighed in the invisible calculus of the reward. Cooperation, the fragile thread that had allowed life to persist under slavery, began to unravel. Small acts of sabotage appeared, a mislaid sack, a spilled water gourd, whispered rumors that slowed someone down. Nothing overt, nothing the overseer could punish, but enough to shift the balance, enough to feed the system's efficiency. It was a perverse triumph of psychology. By offering recognition, Constance had replaced collective resilience with individual competition. The field became a laboratory. Each man, each family, was now both subject and observer. Bonds that had sustained generations were replaced by the metrics of performance. Even loyalty became transactional. Trust was measured, tested, and ultimately weaponized. Drummond watched helplessly as the community's cohesion dissolved. He had thought the reward might increase output, yes, but he had not anticipated that it would corrode identity itself. Men who had once shared water, shelter, and protection now hoarded scraps, guarded their techniques, and calculated each movement to outperform the neighbor. The psychology of scarcity, already a feature of their bondage, was amplified by the illusion of choice. Each act of effort, each ounce of cotton picked, was a vote in Constance's system, a signal that obedience had been internalized. What made this particularly cruel was its invisibility. To outsiders, Belle Haven thrived. The harvests were extraordinary. To historians decades later, the story reads as efficiency, genius, or luck. But the quarters themselves tell a different story. A community divided, suspicion baked into every interaction, intimacy replaced by competition. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the fields into the hearts of families, into the quiet spaces between men, where whispers of solidarity once existed. This fracture of community is a signature of all systems built on internalized control. It is the moment when the oppressed enforce their own oppression, when desire and hope are harnessed to power structures rather than freedom. Belle Haven demonstrates this in its purest form. Reward becomes leverage, recognition becomes a weapon, and loyalty to the system replaces loyalty to one another. By early autumn, the consequences of Constance Granger's reward system had reached their apex. Productivity soared beyond any expectation. Numbers that had once seemed impossible were now routine. Yet behind the ledger pages and gleaming cotton bales, a quieter, more disturbing toll emerged. Men worked longer hours, pushed through exhaustion and ignored injuries, all in pursuit of recognition that was as fleeting as it was intoxicating. The human body endured beyond reason, and the mind was trapped in a continuous cycle of anticipation, calculation, and anxiety. Those who succeeded felt a complex mixture of pride and dread. Isaac, once calm and steady, now moved through the fields like a machine, every movement measured against the invisible standard of Constance's reward. Caleb, young and ambitious, pushed past the point of safety, fingers raw from labor, back aching, lungs burning, all to surpass his peers. Samuel, older and wiser, found himself caught between shame and necessity, unable to resist participation even as it violated his sense of morality. Each man was trapped in a psychological loop. Succeed or be erased, excel or fall behind, endure or disappear. Constance observed it all with clinical detachment. Her ledger became a map of human endurance. Each encounter, each reward was recorded, not just the quantity of cotton harvested, but the behavioral changes, the fractures of community, the subtle emergence of competition over collaboration. She had created a system in which desire, hope, and ambition became tools of control, bending even the strongest wills to her design. Drummond, the overseer, increasingly recognized his own complicity. He tallied numbers, recorded results, and observed breakdowns with mounting unease. He understood the paradox. The more successful the system, the greater the suffering it inflicted, and yet no visible punishment existed. No overt cruelty was necessary. The reward itself carried the weight of both incentive and oppression. The psychological consequences extended beyond the individual. Community bonds, already strained, dissolved further. Men monitored each other, corrected each other, competed against each other for access to fleeting recognition. The plantation became a microcosm of human behavior under extreme incentive structures, a living laboratory for the most subtle and enduring forms of power, those internalized, self-enforced, and invisible to the casual observer. By the end of the season, Belhaven had produced a harvest unprecedented in its history, yet the cost, silent, psychological, and invisible, was evident in every glance, every hesitation, every nervous calculation made by those who had endured the reward system. As the harvest ended and the last bales were loaded onto the riverboats, Constance Granger stood in the main house alone, staring at the ledgers that charted the human cost of her experiment. The numbers were flawless, the yields unprecedented, but she could not escape the awareness that her success was built on something more fragile and terrifying than cotton. The minds of the men in her fields had been bent, reshaped, and measured. The community itself had been fractured. And though she had achieved what no neighbor expected, she felt a hollowness that no ledger could quantify. She wrote in her journal late into the night, her pen moving with meticulous care. They obey not me, but the promise of recognition. They compete against one another, and I watch. I am invisible, yet omnipresent. This is not mastery, it is architecture, and architecture is never innocent. The words reflected a rare moment of self-awareness, an acknowledgement that her genius was inseparable from cruelty, that power always carries an echo of corruption, no matter how subtle. Constance considered the men individually. Isaac, who had carried himself with quiet pride, now moved with the weight of invisible expectations. Caleb, whose ambition had driven him past reason, bore a nervous vigilance that made him both more productive and more fragile. Samuel, older and conflicted, balanced between shame and necessity, had internalized the system so completely that he could no longer distinguish desire from compulsion. Each mind, each body, was a reflection of the mechanics she had set in motion, and each carried the mark of a psychological calculus she both admired and feared. Even the overseer, Silas Drummond, had become a witness to a phenomenon beyond his comprehension. He recognized that control had transcended authority. The plantation now functioned as a self-perpetuating system, requiring neither whip nor command. It was efficiency elevated to a form of invisible mastery, but mastery that demanded an ethical reckoning Constance herself could not ignore. And yet, there was no outward sign of remorse. Constance maintained her composure, continued to entertain visiting factors, and presented the image of a capable widow managing her estate with brilliance. The visible world saw only productivity and order. The invisible world, the one she had shaped in the quarters, was an entirely different reality. It was a world of desire weaponized, hope redirected, and human psychology manipulated in the service of wealth. Belhaven had achieved perfection, but the perfection was hollow. And even Constance, the architect of this silent domination, understood that mastery of the machine, the system, did not equate to mastery of morality. The ledger could measure output, but it could not measure conscience. The men who labored under Constance's reward system carried its consequences long after the harvest ended. The fields were empty, the bales gone, but the psychological imprint remained etched into memory and behavior. They had been trained to measure themselves in output, to value recognition above camaraderie, to internalize competition as survival. Even when the immediate threat of reward vanished, the habits persisted. Every glance, every step, every decision was filtered through the invisible calculus they had been forced to adopt. Isaac walked the quarters in silence, avoiding interaction unless necessary. He measured every word, every gesture, as if the ledger of his life still existed in some unseen hand. Caleb, brimming with restless energy, found himself unable to relax, his mind perpetually racing to outperform some invisible rival. Samuel, older and wiser, carried a quiet despair, understanding the futility of competition, but unable to resist participating in its logic. The system had reshaped more than labor. It had reshaped perception itself. This was the subtle cruelty of Belhaven. The harvest ended, but obedience and self-surveillance persisted. The community bonds, once a lifeline, remained fractured. Mutual support, sharing of knowledge and collective resilience had been eroded. Men measured one another constantly, calculating effort, anticipating advantage, fearing disfavor. Even in moments of supposed rest, the plantation's architecture lingered in thought, a ghost of control that could not be exorcised. Constance observed from her veranda, taking note in her journal of the residual effects. She wrote with a clinical detachment. The reward endures longer than the hand that grants it. They govern themselves now, and I am no longer necessary, yet the traces remain, in their eyes, in their hesitation, in their need for acknowledgement. Her system had outlived its immediate purpose, extending control beyond her conscious oversight. The architecture of obedience had become self-perpetuating. This legacy illustrates a broader truth. Manipulation of desire, hope, and recognition leaves scars that are invisible but enduring. Systems of power do not require constant enforcement. Once internalized, control persists in the minds and behaviors of those subjected to it. Belhaven is a case study not only in productivity, but in the enduring consequences of psychological manipulation, how it shapes identity, fractures community, and sustains itself long after the overseer departs. The harvest ended, but the experiment lived on, in the habits, in the mistrust, and in the invisible chains the mind itself constructed. Belhaven's experiment did not end at the edges of its fields. Its methods, consciously or unconsciously, rippled outward, shaping behaviors and expectations across Wilcox County and beyond. Traders, preachers, and visiting factors carried stories of the plantation's astonishing yields, of the strange order in the quarters, and of the widow who commanded obedience without overt cruelty. In whispered conversations, they described efficiency that seemed unnatural, discipline that required no oversight, and laborers who monitored themselves as though the system existed in their bones. These tales seeded ideas in the minds of others. Neighboring planters began experimenting with subtle incentives, mimicking Constance's methods in their own fields. Rewards, privileges, and small displays of favor replaced direct punishment. Even when these imitations were crude, they revealed the principle: control need not be enforced externally. It could be internalized. The architecture of obedience had traveled. Belhaven had become a model, a legend, and a blueprint. Historians centuries later noted the miracle productivity of Wilcox County plantations in the 1840s, yet few connected it to the psychological mechanisms at play. Numbers were cited, techniques praised, and outcomes measured, but the invisible human cost remained undocumented. What persisted were the stories passed down in whispers, diaries, and letters. The system's power was silent, pervasive, and adaptable, and in each retelling, the lesson endured. Desire is more malleable than fear, and hope is a stronger leash than chains. This propagation illustrates a crucial truth about systems of control. Innovation in governance or management does not require visibility or recognition. A single, carefully observed method can influence generations of behavior across communities and even across centuries. Belhaven's influence was psychological, not merely economic. It demonstrated how mastery of human desire, subtle, invisible, and internalized, creates obedience that outlasts the enforcer. By the end of the decade, the legend of Belhaven had entered regional consciousness. Planters recounted the widow's brilliance, noting how her men competed against each other, how labor increased, and how oversight became nearly obsolete. But none fully acknowledged the ethical cost: the fractured communities, the internalized anxiety, the minds conditioned to police themselves. The system worked flawlessly, in appearance, because no one outside recognized the manipulation embedded deep within. Belhaven had become more than a plantation. It was a prototype, a whisper of psychological architecture that would echo through history. The principles Constance Granger employed at Belhaven were not lost to history, they evolved. Over decades, the logic of internalized control resurfaced in factories, schools, and corporate offices, morphing into systems more sophisticated yet fundamentally identical. Metrics replaced bales of cotton, performance reviews replaced the reward, and algorithms quietly replaced overseers. The blueprint remained. Make people believe they are choosing, competing, and earning, while the system silently directs their behavior. Modern institutions replicate Belhaven's architecture without acknowledging its origins. Productivity metrics, incentive programs, gamified apps, social media rankings, all operate on the same psychological levers: desire, hope, recognition, and subtle competition. The human mind becomes the enforcement mechanism. Just as the men in the fields measured themselves against one another for the promise of intimacy and acknowledgement, employees, students, and users today measure themselves against invisible benchmarks, chasing rewards curated by distant architects. The parallels are striking. Just as Constance fractured community bonds to enhance productivity, contemporary systems cultivate competition over collaboration, isolating individuals while ensuring efficiency. Self-surveillance replaces external oversight. Obedience, once coerced by fear, is now maintained voluntarily, disguised as aspiration. Every metric, every leaderboard, every notification functions like Belhaven's reward, subtle, invisible, and devastatingly effective. And the cost, as always, is internal. Anxiety, burnout, distrust, and the quiet erosion of autonomy replicate the psychological scars left by Belhaven. Success becomes both a motivator and a cage. The mind learns to police itself, craving acknowledgement even as it becomes complicit in its own control. The system feeds on its participants, yet they perceive only opportunity and merit. The machine evolves, but its principles remain the same. Understanding Belhaven is essential because it shows the roots of modern compliance and invisible control. It is a case study in how desire can be weaponized, how hope can enforce labor, and how competition can fracture solidarity. Constance Granger's experiment was more than historical aberration. It is the progenitor of methods used globally to shape behavior, often without awareness. The lesson is clear. Mastery of systems, whether plantations or corporations, algorithms or institutions, depends less on visible authority and more on understanding the invisible architecture of desire. Belhaven is the ancestor of that architecture, a shadow that persists in every system that convinces people to govern themselves. The ethical consequences of Belhaven's experiment extend far beyond its time. Constance Granger's system was more than productivity, it was the manipulation of the human psyche itself. By making desire and hope into instruments of control, she bypassed laws, oversight, and even morality. The men in the fields became willing participants in their own subjugation, yet the suffering was no less real. Their minds carried the weight long after the work ended, shaping behavior, trust, and identity in ways impossible to quantify. This is the legacy of invisible control. It normalizes compliance without visible oppression. Generations internalize the logic that reward and recognition define worth. The subtle fractures in community, the quiet rivalries, the compulsive self-surveillance, these become inherited patterns, echoing through families, workplaces, and institutions. What begins as efficiency becomes culture. What begins as incentive becomes obligation. Belhaven proves that the most enduring power is not the whip, the gun, or the law, but the architecture of belief, desire, and internalized hierarchy. The ethical cost is compounded by invisibility. The men in the quarters could identify their suffering, but not the system itself. Modern parallels are equally insidious. Employees compete for rankings, children internalize achievement metrics, social media users chase validation, all the while believing they are exercising freedom. In every case, the system survives by remaining unseen, by convincing the subject that the constraints are self-imposed. that participation is choice. Belhaven demonstrates that morality is not simply about action, it is about the architecture that enables or constrains behavior. A system can be efficient and invisible, yet fundamentally cruel. Constance understood this intuitively. She documented it clinically. The ledger tracked cotton, but her journal recorded the fractures, the internalized obedience, the psychological cost. History often celebrates efficiency but rarely acknowledges the human lives that sustain it. And that is the danger of repeating these patterns without reflection. When invisible control becomes normalized, suffering is disguised as achievement, compliance is celebrated as ambition, hope is weaponized, desire exploited, and competition internalized. Belhaven is a warning, not merely a story. Mastery of systems without conscience perpetuates human cost across generations, often without detection. Long-term exposure to Belhaven's system reshaped more than behavior, it reshaped identity. The men in the fields began to measure their worth in outputs, in favors granted, in fleeting acknowledgement. Isaac, Caleb, Samuel all learned to internalize the logic of the reward so deeply that it became a lens through which every decision, every action, every thought was filtered. Even when removed from the immediate environment, the architecture persisted in memory, in instinct, in the body itself. This is the hidden terror of internalized control. It transforms self-perception. Success is no longer an abstract or personal measure, it is proof of conformity. Identity becomes transactional. Morality is recalculated based on survival and recognition, rather than intrinsic values. Desire becomes a tool that can be manipulated both by others and by oneself. The men did not merely obey, they became co-creators of their own subjugation. They trained themselves to perform, to anticipate, to compete, and to monitor every move against invisible standards. Drummond observed, powerless to intervene. The system required neither overseer nor punishment. It had become self-sustaining, feeding on the participants' own desire for validation. Even when moral intuition protested, the psychological architecture was stronger. The illusion of choice made the bondage complete. Each man believed he was exercising agency, yet each act of agency reinforced the invisible chains. The long-term transformation extended beyond the individual to the social fabric. The bonds of trust, the shared strategies of survival, the collective solidarity, all eroded. Men who had once supported one another now measured every act for potential advantage. Community became competition. Cooperation was replaced by subtle sabotage, rivalry, and the quiet anxiety of constant evaluation. The plantation was no longer just a site of labor. It had become a laboratory of the mind. This pattern is reflected in modern systems. When performance, recognition, and reward dominate, the self becomes a reflection of external metrics rather than intrinsic values. The architecture of Belhaven endures in offices, classrooms, social networks, and algorithms. Success is quantified, competition is normalized, and internalized surveillance becomes instinct. Individuals unknowingly become their own enforcers, perpetuating systems designed to control them. The human mind is both resilient and vulnerable, capable of extraordinary endurance, yet pliable under invisible pressure. Belhaven illustrates the terrifying potency of this principle. When hope, desire, and recognition are manipulated, identity itself becomes the instrument of obedience. By the end of the second year, the social system within Belhaven had reached a breaking point. Productivity remained astonishing, but the human cost was no longer subtle. It was visible in expression, posture, and interaction. Men moved with vigilance, scanning one another for advantage or weakness. Conversations were measured, laughter rare, solidarity replaced by suspicion. The very fabric of the community had been rewritten by a system that required compliance, competition, and self-surveillance. Even Constance could sense the fracture. The ledger showed success. The cotton yields were unparalleled. Yet her journal reflected unease. She recorded observations with meticulous care. They obey, but they are no longer whole. Bonds that sustained them are severed. Desire drives them, yet it is a borrowed force, not their own. This is not cruelty in the overt sense, but it is cruelty nonetheless. For the first time, the architect of obedience confronted the moral shadow of her design. Drummond, too, recognized the depth of the system's influence. He had witnessed subtle acts of sabotage, deliberate slowing of work, and quiet rivalries that had not existed before. The men's discipline was extraordinary, but it was born of internalized anxiety and competition, not loyalty or choice. He realized that Belhaven had achieved efficiency at the cost of the human spirit, and that no overseer's whip could ever replicate the subtle, pervasive, and enduring power of Constance's methods. The plantation had become a microcosm of total control. The architecture of obedience had outstripped its physical boundaries and reshaped society itself. Every act of labor, every measure of ambition, every interaction was governed by the invisible system she had constructed. Men enforced their own submission, monitored one another, and perpetuated the cycle. And yet, in this triumph of control, there was moral dissonance. Constance's reward had worked too well, producing compliance at the cost of humanity. This collapse of social cohesion illustrates a fundamental truth about invisible systems of control. Efficiency can be maximized at the expense of ethics, and human capital can be exploited, not just in body, but in mind. Belhaven demonstrates the paradox of mastery. The more complete the control, the greater the moral burden, and the more profound the psychological consequences. The system endures in form, but the lives within it are fractured, reshaped, and, in ways visible only to those who look closely, profoundly diminished. The plantation was thriving, yet its success carried the weight of quiet suffering, a testament to the invisible, enduring power of psychological manipulation. The legacy of Belhaven extends far beyond the Alabama fields, echoing through history and into the frameworks of modern institutions. Constance Granger's experiment revealed a principle that transcends time. When desire, hope, and recognition are weaponized, control can persist indefinitely without overt force. The men in her fields became both agents and victims of the system, internalizing its logic and perpetuating its rules long after the cotton was harvested. This principle, once understood, can be seen everywhere, in corporations, governments, schools, and digital networks. Efficiency, productivity, and obedience often appear as the fruits of rational organization. But Belhaven demonstrates a darker truth. Those outcomes can be achieved by exploiting the mind's deepest vulnerabilities. Recognition becomes leverage, competition becomes self-enforcement, hope becomes invisible chains. The architecture of obedience that Constance designed, intentionally or instinctively, anticipated the mechanisms of modern control. Systems that appear voluntary often replicate Belhaven's psychological blueprint. Historians, economists, and behavioral scientists have since documented similar patterns. Incentive systems that maximize output while minimizing oversight rely on the same principle. People will self-regulate if they believe that effort and compliance are directly linked to recognition or reward. The subtlety of this control makes it nearly impossible to detect and nearly impossible to resist. Belhaven was a precursor, a proof of concept that demonstrated the power of internalized obedience before modern corporations, bureaucracies, and social platforms refined it to perfection. The ethical implications are profound. The human cost of efficiency is often invisible, obscured by numbers, outputs, or achievements. The same mechanisms that increased cotton yields or paid fractured communities, eroded trust, and reshaped identities. In modern systems, similar costs manifest as burnout, anxiety, competition over collaboration, and self-surveillance. The machinery of control thrives because it is both invisible and internalized. Belhaven's legacy is therefore not just historical, it is instructive. Understanding its architecture allows us to recognize how systems exploit desire and hope, and how individuals become complicit in their own regulation. The plantation was more than a site of labor. It was a laboratory for the mind, producing lessons that remain relevant to anyone who navigates institutions designed to control, reward, and exploit human behavior. The personal toll of Belhaven's system was invisible to outsiders, but devastating to those who endured it. Each man carried the weight of expectation, the constant calculation of effort, and the silent anxiety of competition. Isaac, Caleb, Samuel, and others moved through life measuring every breath, every motion, every word against the invisible standard Constance had imposed. Even in moments of rest, their minds remained captive, rehearsing the strategies of survival and success that had been drilled into them. Sleep offered little relief. Dreams were haunted by the fields, by the anticipation of the reward, and by the fractures in human connection that the system had created. Friendships eroded, solidarity became suspicion. The men had learned to measure each other's ambition, to anticipate potential sabotage, and to guard their own behaviors carefully. Every action became transactional, every interaction a test of loyalty or advantage. Their humanity had been commandeered by the architecture of control. The psychological scars endured beyond the plantation. Former laborers carried the patterns of internalized obedience into their families, communities, and interactions with strangers. Anxiety, mistrust, and the instinct to compete or self-monitor became ingrained habits. Even when freed from the immediate authority of Belhaven, the mental structures it imposed remained. The reward system had taught a lesson more permanent than chains. The mind itself could be trained to serve someone else's design. Constance, meanwhile, documented these effects with clinical detachment. Her journal noted the fractures, the compulsions, the ways that men police themselves and one another. She recognized the brilliance of the system, but also its cruelty. Unlike the casual historian, she witnessed the human cost firsthand, yet she justified it as efficiency, as survival, as necessity. Her rationalization reveals a truth that endures in every system that manipulates desire. The closer control comes to invisible mastery, the harder it is to confront the ethical implications. Belhaven proves that power exercised subtly is often more complete than power exercised openly. Minds can be shaped, loyalty redirected, and hope weaponized in ways that produce obedience without violence. The visible world may see productivity, but the psychological toll, the erosion of agency, and the fractures of community remain hidden, enduring, and profound. Belhaven is more than a historical case. It is a symbol, a warning etched into the architecture of human behavior. Constance Granger's reward system illuminates the mechanisms by which power can operate invisibly, bending desire, hope, and recognition to enforce compliance. The Plantation teaches that control does not require overt coercion. Psychology alone can enslave, fracture, and dominate. What was true in 1841 Alabama is true wherever systems rely on internalized obedience. The subtle becomes absolute, the invisible becomes binding, and freedom is an illusion. The symbolic lessons extend beyond the fields and beyond history. Institutions that measure, rank, and reward behavior are often Belhavens in disguise. Corporate hierarchies, educational systems, social networks, even political structures all utilize the same architecture: metrics of performance, recognition as leverage, and competition disguised as opportunity. Individuals become complicit, monitoring themselves, measuring themselves, competing against peers, all while believing they exercise autonomy. This is mastery without force, obedience without chains, compliance without awareness. Belhaven also demonstrates the fragility of human community under such systems. Collaboration is replaced by rivalry, solidarity by suspicion, mutual aid by self-preservation. The social bonds that sustain human resilience are eroded, leaving only calculation, vigilance, and the relentless pursuit of recognition. The moral and psychological cost of efficiency, though invisible to most observers, is profound and enduring. And yet, awareness of this architecture provides an opportunity. Recognition of the mechanisms of internalized control is the first step toward reclaiming agency. The story of Belhaven urges reflection. If desire, hope, and recognition can be weaponized to fracture communities and reshape minds, understanding those forces allows individuals to resist, navigate, and master them rather than be mastered. There is power in comprehension and in naming the invisible systems that shape behavior. Now, pause for a moment. If you understand the gravity of what Belhaven teaches, type the symbolic phrase, "I see the architecture," in the comments. By acknowledging the system, you lock in awareness, a subtle act of resistance and self-mastery. This is more than engagement. It is a recognition of invisible power, a declaration that you will navigate influence with eyes wide open. Belhaven closes not with resolution, but with reflection. The fields are empty, the cotton shipped, the ledger complete. Constance Granger's experiment endures, not in bales of cotton, but in the invisible architecture she built. The minds she shaped, the bonds she fractured, the desires she weaponized. History may record efficiency, wealth, and innovation, but the human cost is often silent, unseen, lingering in the patterns of behavior, the shadows of memory, and the quiet fractures of community. The men who survived the reward system carried it with them for life. Isaac, Caleb, Samuel, each bore a subtle imprint, a permanent reconfiguration of identity. They learned to govern themselves, to measure every act, every glance, every breath against invisible standards. Obedience became internalized, competition internalized, desire itself a tool of compliance. The system had left the plantation, embedding itself in minds and behaviors far beyond the white columns of Belhaven. The legacy of Belhaven is a warning to all who seek mastery over others or themselves. Control is most complete when invisible, when hope and recognition become instruments of compliance. Efficiency is seductive, but efficiency without conscience fractures communities, erodes trust, and leaves psychological scars invisible to the casual observer. History repeats because few recognize the architecture beneath the surface, the subtle levers that bend desire and mold behavior. And yet, there is a final lesson. Awareness is power. Understanding Belhaven, its methods, its mechanisms, its consequences, allows us to recognize the invisible systems around us. When you see the architecture, you reclaim agency. When you recognize the weaponization of hope, desire, and recognition, you step outside the system. You refuse to participate unconsciously. You measure but do not submit. You observe but do. Not internalize, Belhaven endures as both a historical horror and a psychological case study. Its story is a mirror, reflecting the subtle ways power manipulates, shapes, and dominates. And in that reflection lies the choice: to be governed by invisible forces or to see them, name them, and master them. The plantation may have been built on cotton, cruelty, and calculation, but its true lesson survives in the minds of those who dare to look closely and refuse to be fooled by appearances. The architecture of obedience is real, enduring, and everywhere. The choice is yours. Walk through it blindly or walk through it with eyes wide open.